if I were to ask a liberal what their general principles are, I think they often default to my principles are fighting injustice and inequality. And that feels good to say. Now, I find these things problematic just because these are goals. They're not governing principles. But focusing on the inequality question, it always seems to me that there's no standard by which inequality will be solved, right? It's never enough. And so it's problematic from that standpoint. But it doesn't mean that we don't have an interest in making sure that people can rise up out of a certain income group. That seems to me to be the better question. So what are your general thoughts on that? What's the best way to increase wages for our bottom quintile of earners, aside from mandates like the minimum wage, which we've already discussed a little bit. It's shown not to work. It's shown to hurt people that we're trying to help. But it doesn't mean we don't have an interest in making sure those opportunities exist. So just from a policy standpoint, what do you think is the right way to go?
Well, I think you're right. Now, of course, there's this problem that these are buzzwords and they're not defined, and who knows what they mean. Once somebody says, I worry about inequality, then we're already, you're trying to be generous. You're saying, well, maybe you mean something else. You worry about lack of opportunity for lower income Americans, which I think is something that is true and we all worry about. But when they say we worry about inequality, they might mean we worry about inequality, which is really just envy. You and I have exactly our jobs now, and Steve Jobs goes out and invents the iPhone and makes $1 billion. Why are we worse off? That's a good question to ask. If we simply take the society exactly the way it is now, and take all the rich people and send them to guillotines, we have better inequality. How are we better off for doing that? That's when you say I care about inequality, that's what you are saying. You are saying that we're better off by shooting the rich people than we were before.
I mean, and that comment isn't that far off, since a lot of the sloganeering on the streets is "eat the rich." So it's
exactly.
We're just repeating what they say.
You're doing them. This is the problem with these words. When they say injustice, they don't mean. When you say justice, you mean individuals are equal before the law and treated fairly and swiftly. And properly for their individual actions. Sorry, justice now is social justice. It's climate justice. It doesn't mean anything like what you mean when you think of justice.
Right. It's more of a. It's more of a.
Also, these are inequality and justice goes with poverty and racism and colonialism. I don't know if you've been following the woke. We have to worry still about colonialism, even though we haven't invaded a country in 50 years. Actually, I was reading. The Association of University Presses just issued a statement a couple months ago pledging itself to refrain from colonialism. I didn't know that they'd invaded countries. You have to recognize these are meaningless buzzwords. But I salute you for saying, look, there's a common ground here. I don't think they'll let you off with this, but there's a common ground here. What you might mean by inequality is we're worried about the status of Americans stuck on the lower parts of our social and economic ladder, and that they seem to be stuck there forever, and that your guys' programs are making things worse. These have become industries. The industry of fighting poverty will be out of business if there's no poverty. The industry of fighting racism will be out of business if there's no racism. So they have a lot of interest in keeping these matters going. But yes, so let's talk about opportunity. Largely, again, let's start with getting out of the way. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the educational system, which is a crime on what it does to lower income and minority Americans. The barriers in the way of getting jobs, of moving from place to place, are still there. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. How can you have generations that are culturally separate, and that now more than half of children are born and brought up by single women. Mm-hmm. Babies who are not talked to by their first and second year are just a cognitive disadvantage, that you can give them all the pre-K and subsidized whatever you want for the rest of their lives. That's going to stay in their way. So I think, yes, what we should talk about is It doesn't matter to a poor kid in Fresno who's stuck in a bad high school and will never get a job, whether a hedge fund manager flies in a prop or a jet, which is what inequality warriors are worried about. What matters to that kid is having a decent background, living in a safe community, having a decent education, having a chance possibly to move to a better place and get a good job. And that there's a lot we can do first to get out of the way before we layer on more programs that have unintended consequences, just like the current programs do. But that's what we should be talking about.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of space for that on the right to finally fill that void with some real policy solutions. Now, some of those are harder because some of those are cultural, right? The single motherhood is a cultural thing. There's not an obvious. I mean, we could reverse some of the Great Society programs that incentivize single parenthood, but we've got to figure out how not to leave these people out to dry either. Who are at that bottom rung. So that's a complicated policy discussion, but we got to talk about it. What you mentioned, which is not speaking to children in their first year or two, that's enormous. That's enormous for cognitive development. Again, how do you fix that?
Let's just start. So we're talking about high school curriculum. The state of California just said there has to be a new diversity training in the high school curriculum. So why isn't high school include basic civics anymore? Mm-hmm. A little bit of how the criminal justice system works, which they probably need to know, and parenting classes. You can't graduate high school until you've had some basic parenting classes.
Yeah. Those are some concrete things that we could actually do. I'd also point out, and I would point this out many times in hearings here, which is the highest growth rate in wages was the bottom quintile of earners over the last few years, and that can't be explained by Obama. The Obama types love to say, no, Trump was just sailing off of the great growth rates of the Obama era, but there was a clear spike after the tax cuts in the bottom quintile of earners, and so it seems obvious to me that pro-growth, tighter labor markets generally affect the lowest quintile of earners in the most positive way.
So we've got to stop and celebrate this tremendously, and it's unfortunately got forgotten because of COVID. The great things that happen in labor markets for minorities, for poor people, for underprivileged people, convicts were getting jobs. All sorts of great things were happening just because of a tight labor market, not because of federal programs for one thing or another. The best protection, best labor market protection you can offer people is competition. Yeah. And especially the left tends to, we got to protect the worker, not let the employer exploit him and carve this thing up. No, the best possible, take this job, and the ability to say, take this job and shove it, is the best protection you could offer.